AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Afsheen Afshar. So Afsheen has held many interesting roles throughout his journey, notably being the first Chief Data Scientist Officer in Wall Street. And after that, he was the first Chief AI Officer in the private equity industry. And now Afsheen sits on many advisory boards and has his own private practice. Afsheen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, JP. A pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is ours. So already in the introduction, quite an interesting background, held many interesting roles along the way. You've obviously got a broad level overview of different industries. What was the main driving factor in choosing to set up your own firm and focus on helping organizations implement and utilize AI and then support companies who are already stepping into that venture?
Yeah, I think there's two different types of answers to that. I'll do the perhaps more soapboxy answer first, and then the more commercial answer second. The soapboxy answer is, even a casual observer of technology will notice that there seems to be an ever-increasing concentration of capabilities in ever fewer hands and companies. And we strongly believe that there needs to be a societal and an industrial counterbalance to that, meaning that we want to help empower these smaller companies that, be it a cultural reason or a cash flow reason or an access reason, don't have the ability to take advantage of all these new capabilities, and we want to enable them and empower them to do so. And the mechanism that we're choosing to do that is through an investment mechanism, a holding company mechanism, which enables us to have the empowerment and the speed required to have that sort of rapid change. So that's the social view lens on it, where we think the ability to provide that societal and social counterweight, and it's ever present in our politics, ever present in our demographics, especially in the United States. And we want to be that one of the agents of that change. Now, the commercial side of it is, there are so many companies, small, medium, and large, that have the substrate, meaning the data sets, the access, the capabilities, the infrastructure, to benefit tremendously from modern technology, whether or not it's as fancy sounding as artificial intelligence, or candidly as mundane sounding as a better ERP system, or just the use of cloud, or a better iPhone app, or whatever. That opportunity is massive. It's very broad, and basically no one out there is deploying these technologies to those small businesses. So you can convert a company that has, let's call it a 10% bottom line margin, to a 15% bottom line margin rather straightforwardly by doing standard things like taking commercially available componentry, stitching them together, and just deploying them in under 6 months. And by doing so, you can have huge return on investment for a rather minimal investment. So that's the commercial angle as to why we're approaching it this way.
Yeah, I think it makes absolute sense. And I'm sure there's going to be people listening who are in that small to medium size category, or people who have a business idea who could benefit from somebody like yourself and your venture. We spoke previously about making data accessible to everyone, and you were talking about the capabilities and democratizing data. It'd be interesting to see where you see the opportunities across various industries, talking about some of the bottlenecks that are currently faced and what can be done once data is being made accessible to various organizations or industries.
I would argue that the impediment is cultural on both sides of the aisle, meaning the non-technical people as well as the culture of technical people. And combined with that factor, a lack of organizational will to take up these new technologies. So let's deal with the first in turn. So as I think most people who've dealt with technical people know, I'm speaking as a technical person myself, it is a rare technical person who can speak the language of business in a native tongue, or to the degree to a native level. And that strongly impedes the ability of technical people and non-technical people to engage. And what I often said to my teams is that EQ is more important than IQ to be a data scientist. And I think that's that's even more true today than it's ever been. So I think there's a lot of work that technical people need to do to explain why, from a business perspective, AI, technologies, machine learning, whatever you want to call it, is particularly business relevant and particularly critical to an existential degree to the future of the business. Now, on the other side, I would argue that business people, the days where a business leader doesn't need to understand the details of how technology and analytics specifically work are past. It's going to be my prediction. I'll make a strong prediction on this podcast that 10 years from now, all the future major business leaders are going to be much more analytically savvy than they are today. And maybe that's not a risky prediction given the trends, but it's going to be a really critical capability. And to be fair to business folks, we've seen lots of senior leaders publicly and privately educate themselves on Coursera, or MBA programs take up data science coursework, or Python for MBAs and so forth. So we've seen that side as well. But I would argue that bridging the cultural divide is a major impediment. The other thing I mentioned was organizational will, which I think is an outgrowth of bridging the cultural divide. At the end of the day, we're talking about a revolution. We're talking about a fundamental change in how the business operates. You need to have the will at the top to do that. And very few traditional companies have truly demonstrated, really put money where their mouth is, really took a huge, a material commitment against making that change happen. And I think we're going to see a lot of companies either do that over the next 10 years or fail to survive over the next 10 years.
I think it's an incredibly important point that you talked about, the adaptability, and it's very much a case of organizations who don't embrace this fully one way or the other are going to be left behind. It's good to hear that there's senior leaders who are embracing this and looking to move it along. For it to be successful, you could have a CEO who has the financial means and the appetite, but we often hear about data science projects failing because, for a whole host of reasons, which we don't need to get into now. But for a traditional business to fully digitize, how would you break down the key elements to that if it was step by step, or one of the many CEOs in your network, if they call you up and ask, okay, I want to do this, what are the steps, in what order do I need to get this rolling? What do you say to those folks?
Thank you for that question. Love that question. So it comes out of the fundamental tenets of classic management consulting engagements, meaning start from the business problems and work backwards to the data and technology required to have business impact. What most people who have occupied positions with similar titles to the ones I've enjoyed do is they start from technology and data and try to get something interesting. I have never had a successful project that started that way. If I had a nickel for every time some business leader called me and said, hey, I just read about insert your technique here, or why can't we look at Twitter data and find something interesting? I'd be a very rich man. And whenever I get those phone calls, I always say that is absolutely not the approach that we're going to take. What we are going to do is talk about your business and what keeps you up at night. So in terms of making a recipe book for that hypothetical CEO, it would be a 98% business conversation and a 2% technology conversation, meaning we spend the vast majority of the time talking about their business. What are the threats of that business? What are the promises of that business? What keeps the CEO up at night? What are the directions they'd like to move into? And then from that conversation, we would distill actionable insights that, if hypothetically we could generate, that the business will be materially better, and importantly, that we could measure how much it would be materially better. That measurement of success is a very key component as well. So once you have the actionable insight for a measurable business outcome, then you move backwards and say, in my mind, in the mind of the technologist and machine learning experts' mind, what are the analyses that we would need to do to make those sets of actionable insights? And then you go backwards and say, well, what data do I need to centralize, to clean, to feed those pieces of analytics, to feed those actionable insights, to measure those outcomes? When done that way, every project that you do has a measurable benefit. You can compute the return on investment, and as a consequence, you can make a proper business case like any business person would on any business venture. And then the quote digitization effort is a business investment like any other. Now, what I've seen many, I would say the vast majority of companies that say they're going to do a digitization effort do is they say, we're just going to throw a bunch of money or what they perceive to be a lot of money at this problem. We're not going to have any measures of success. We're just going to centralize our data into one pod and hope something good comes out. I've yet to hear an effort that starts out with that level of lack of focus become successful. So I'm all about starting from business, working backwards, having measures of success, computing ROI, and thereby making a strong business case that feeds itself.
I think that's the playbook. That's it, and I hope people listening to this do follow and benefit from this. I want to circle back a little bit. You talked about how the changes over time and what it takes to be successful in implementing modern data, and you referred to the workforce shortage. And we've seen that evolve over time. And you and I spoke just recently about how the skills required to be successful and how that's changed. Could you speak a little bit to that point and help us all understand how the role of anyone within data? I don't want to say AI because again we're cutting through the noise of all of that, but how the role is evolving and how you see it in the future, what it takes for an individual to be successful should they want to operate in this space.
Yeah, I'm all about hybrids. I think the future leaders, the future effective business professionals are hybrids. Interestingly, I found over time that that's not a popular opinion. So I'm curious as to how that resonates with your audience. But I'm very much a zealot about what I used to call growing unicorns or growing hybrids. So when I think about it, I think about 4 different skill sets. And they're the following. They're technology expertise. So in sort of simple terms, knowing how to code and knowing how to code well. Interestingly, a lot of folks think copy and pasting is coding, but without sounding like too much of an old man, knowing how to write good industrial strength software. That's the first. The second is knowing math. And there used to be a time where people who knew how to code knew math and vice versa, but that's no longer the case. So knowing analytics, knowing math. The third thing is subject matter expertise. I've seen so many companies in financial services, elsewhere, in a variety of industries, erroneously believe that if you hire someone with a fancy sounding PhD, and I'm speaking as someone who's been accused of fitting that description, and no actual subject matter expertise, basically assuming that such a person is a wizard and is going to magically create billions of dollars. I've never seen that be successful either. So you need someone who, if you want to be effective in, let's say, retail, you need someone who actually understands retail. It sounds crazy, but that's actually what you need. And if the person doesn't know retail going into it, they need to be a quick study and put a lot of effort into it. So that's really important. And the last bucket is what I like to call the management consulting skills, EQ, organizational know-how, subtlety, etc. And that's a lot of what we spoke about before, EQ and IQ and so on. A lot of times, people who study data science are very enthralled with the technical aspect of it. And as I said, as someone who's a math and physics and tech nerd for most of my upbringing, I very much empathize with that. I find the math and the technology beautiful and enticing and enthralling and wonderful. But at the end of the day, you need to, you as a person in data and technology, you need to be able to explain and empathize and connect at a human level with your ultimate human consumer of whatever it is you're creating. And if you can't do that, it's going to fall flat. And I've seen too many very talented people who don't put the effort to grow that skill set be incredibly ineffective in traditional organizations. And it's because that they don't develop that skill. So you need all four. That may seem like an unrealistic bar. And often when I give presentations where I advocate for these four skills, people come back and say, you don't need all four, do you? And I always respond, well, if you want to be successful, you do. So typically what I've done in my organizations is build training programs with vertical champions for each of these four skills, and have the junior people rotate through and have an ever increasing minimum bar across any of the four as folks become more senior. But it's I think it's absolutely necessary. I think the people who can develop deep skill sets and expertise across all four will be extraordinarily successful. I think unreasonably successful, candidly. And I think the ones who can't, who are remedial in any of the four, will struggle mightily.
I think this is a hugely important point to stay on for a little bit longer, just because you're speaking from a place of running some of the largest and most successful data science practices in well-recognized brands. And to your point, there's going to be many people listening now who instinctively want to disagree, and they want to say that, you know what, you don't need to be good in all of those areas, provided that you're really strong in one. And equally, breaking down into those four buckets as you described them. So with the programming skills, you may not need to be the absolute best. Math, you just need to be able to hold your own. Subject matter expertise, there's many people who have crossed industries and have done so successfully. And then the final one is the communication side. The first three are more binary, where if you're good at math, if you're good at programming, if you have subject matter expertise. The final one is where I spend a lot of time working with leaders of organizations, data science hiring managers, and candidates alike who are, fall short and feel that this is one area that they struggle with the most. But you've spoken previously about how this is a skill just like any other. It can be taught, it can be learned, it can be worked on and developed. And a lot of data science and machine learning engineers may not have the natural appetite for communication, whether it's public speaking or working with non-technical front office. So to those people who are a little bit reserved, what can we do to help them along the way and help them understand that it's a skill just like anything else, and just like they've learned how to code, they can equally learn how to work with non-technical staff, stakeholders, and it's a skill that they absolutely should be adding to their arsenal in order to be successful in the future?
It's a wonderful question. So let me push back a little bit on the first three that you mentioned. What I would say is that the minimum bar across any of the four will continues to increase the more senior you become. That's in my opinion. Meaning that in order to run a world-class data technology AI team, you can't be an F in any of the four. If you're a junior person, sure, no one expects a 21-year-old coming out of college to be an A+ in all four. It's just unreasonable and doesn't happen. But you as you become more senior, you need to increase the dials of the four if you want to be that effective senior leader. So maybe that's a bit of a clarification of my earlier comments. With respect to the EQ, I continue to be tickled or maybe confused, depending upon my mood of the day, as to how few data scientists don't use the tenets of data science on their own career management. Meaning that, data science, to be a little bit geeky for a second, so one very, very popular mechanism or algorithm these days is something called reinforcement learning, where you look, just as a brief primer, you use a utility function that you're optimizing that contains terms that relates to things you want to maximize. And then you have, in service of maximizing that utility function, you have controls on the internal mechanisms of your algorithm. So just taking that metaphor for a second, you could apply that to your own career and say, well, what I want to optimize is whatever you want, whatever your values are. It could be your title, it could be the size of your organization, it could be the compensation, it could be whatever it is. It's not for me to judge as to someone else's value system. But once you have that, what you should do, in my opinion, is observe the world around you and work on your own internals in service of maximizing your utility function. With respect to EQ and empathy, the specific question you asked, that is, at the end of the day, we work in a group. No one's a one-man company is not going to be a really impactful company. So you're going to work by definition in a group. And as a consequence, in order to have maximal impact in that group, in that organization, in that a group of or collection of highly performing professionals, you need to be able to communicate to them in a way that they find effective. And the mechanisms of communication, as you know, we're humans, we're social, are multifold. There is voice and there's words, there's the written form, there's presentations, there's visuals, there's going out to dinner and just shaking hands and so on. And those are all skills, right? And they can be worked on. They're maybe counterintuitive. They may have, you as an individual may have less or more talent at some of those. But like anything else, just like if you find, differential equations more challenging than you find SVMs, you work on differential equations, you get better at it. It's the same thing here, except we're just talking about a different skill set. And so that's the philosophy of it. As a good data scientist, my organizations have plenty of data that shows that as we've grown, many people, we've had people come in who are, by any definition reserved, by any definition initially uncomfortable with these sort of interactions. And what we do is we give them specific actionable feedback, very much like I was saying before with the CEO, where we're talking about giving actionable insights to the company. We give specific actionable feedback in writing emails, in having conversations, and explaining analytics. And over time, people improve. So I think it's just an algorithm. It's a discipline like any other. In this particular case, I think it's a critical discipline for being effective in this field.
I think when you break it down in the language of a data scientist and they can view it in the way in which you've laid out, it should help in them understanding and that it's not to be built up as some monumental feat. It's a process, and you may not ever need to be an A+ in all areas, but there's a certain minimum requirement. And if you don't want to reach a career bottleneck and be prohibited to the next phase, you're going to have to continue to work on all aspects, not just staying up to date in the most modern algorithms and coding languages. So I think that's incredibly helpful. Talking about your approach to building a successful data science team, we've covered, the approach of hybrids and the EQ side of things. But what else do you look for when you're building a new function, a new team? Mm-hmm. What are the standouts that individuals listening who would really love to be a part of your next venture or any future venture, what can they be working on actively, and what do you seek when you're interviewing candidates to join an organization?
Right. So growing an organization, I think the answer to that question is strongly dependent upon the stage of the organization of the data organization at the time of hiring, the needs are different the bigger you become. So to use yet another metaphor, and so as you remember, I'm a doctor, so I'll use one from embryology that hopefully folks are familiar with. When an embryo is fertilized, all the cells can become any part of the body, right? They're called omnipotent stem cells, and I'm sure stem cells is a phrase familiar to most of the audience. The key thing, though, is that any cell can become everything, and that metaphor, I think, carries on to the initial stage of a data science organization or a data organization. It's like any startup. Everybody does everything. And it's in that stage, at that point, where it's most important to be a high-functioning hybrid. Because you're a scrappy team, you're new in an organization, we're proving the ROI to that management team. We're doing lots of POCs. Everyone's doing a little bit of analytics, a little bit of coding, talking to the end stakeholders, doing a little bit of UI work. So that's where the being a high-functioning hybrid walking in is extremely important. As the organization grows, just to put some numbers around it, maybe between 10 and 20, let's say, so around the 12 mark, more or less. Then you have the first splitting event, kind of like the cleavage event in the embryo, if that's familiar to anyone in your audience. And when that happens, I typically cleave the organization between, for lack of a better phrase, folks who are more data-oriented and folks who are more analytics-oriented. Not getting into too much detail, data folks are dealing with we may call it data engineering these days, people who are dealing with data infrastructure, ontologies of data, data quality, data cleanliness, data APIs, and access and privacy, versus folks who are turning that data into analytics, actionable insights, measurable results, and so on and so forth. So that's the first cleavage event, right? And then as you go further, you have subsequent smaller functions. Without wasting too much time, there's smaller functions for each of those. And then you also have folks who will eventually become infrastructure-oriented versus application-oriented. And then as you get even larger to maybe the 100 or so mark, we start having folks who start to become embedded in the sponsorship organizations, who are much more business unit aligned and maybe even be owned by the business unit themselves. This is when we're talking about a data organization inside of a 100,000 person organization like a JP Morgan or an Albertson Safeway, so something like that. So that's the evolution of the organization. And as it becomes more mature and larger, I'm sure you've noted that the roles, in quotations, become more and more specialized. And that's natural for any organization, right? And the swim lanes become better defined, the organizational model becomes better defined, and so on. So if you're trying to join a very mature organization, sort of the impetus on being a true hybrid, as we've been talking about at the very beginning, day zero, is much less. And you can say, well, I'm really interested in being a data ontologist, which is someone who looks at undefined data or poorly defined data and organizes it in a logical, conceptual way. Or I want to be someone who joins the AI research organization to work on just cutting-edge AI algorithms. Everything I said previously around being a hybrid in order to be ever increasingly senior still applies, but in terms of just joining the organization on day one, a mature organization has less need for a hybrid out of the gate. Now, if you're joining a very early organization, 5 or fewer, exactly the opposite would apply. We were looking for someone who, yes, maybe has a relative area of expertise, but is extremely broad, very comfortable working in a poorly defined environment, like a startup. I call these individuals, T-shaped or T-skilled. That's another, I think, McKinsey-esque sentence that I've stolen, where folks are broad but have a depth in one of the areas. Obviously, you want to pick folks who have a different vertical part of their T to the others in the original organization. There's not too much overlap. But that's how certainly we've thought about building organizations over my career. And it's a useful rubric, I think, for your listeners to understand what are the needs of organizations to which they're applying and how that will reflect on their skill sets, but also their growth potential. Obviously, if you join a startup company or a startup group inside of a bigger company, you can have a larger impact on the ultimate direction of the organization than if you join a very mature 5,000 person organization as a very well-defined role.
Afsheen, I think that's a great way to end what's been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate your time. Lots to learn from this at all levels, from senior exec right down to academics who are just trying to figure out their path on this interesting journey. So thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.